Hey students, hope you're having a great day. Today we are going to be delving into the monkey's paw and looking at pretty much all those major elements, as this was a formative piece for us to read. So our learning targets today are going to be, I will be able to understand how the elements of short story are used in the monkey's paw to communicate a theme to the reader. So we're looking at pretty much the whole picture here, okay? So let's go ahead and start with our setting and exposition. All right, it's a very good place to start for the beginning there. So, the question that we have off the top of our head is, what do we know about the setting, and how is it setting up the conflict? So what we're presented with is this kind of rarely visited lane, right? It's kind of off the beaten path. It's sort of sheltered, right? It's sort of cloistered, and we see that also supported by the setting outside. It's stormy outside. It's muddy and wet, and they're all sitting by the firelight, and it's cozy and it's sheltered, right? And the family itself is both physically sheltered, but there's also a sense of being sheltered beyond that we can kind of get in that atmosphere. The atmosphere itself is also ominous and tense, as Mr. White is sitting there playing chess with his son, and he's waiting for someone, right? And they're just kind of, passing the time as they're waiting for this visitor, right? And we learn a number of things about the characters in this point in time. First off, that Mr. White, he's a reckless chess player, right? I mean, so we're playing chess, and it's exposed at the very beginning that he's the type of guy who doesn't think too far ahead about the choices he makes, and he most of the time loses the game, right? His son is the type of guy who really doesn't take that much time to, analyze things. I mean, he's mostly just amused. He doesn't take it or anything too seriously. He's just kind of playing the game for fun, that kind of thing. And we see that play out in different parts as well. Mother is mostly a bystander. While she's watching things happen, she kind of interjects here and there, and we see that play out later on as well. Now, they're waiting for a guy, right? Sgt Major Morris, and he's this guy from recently back from India. He was stationed there, and he comes back a very changed man. On the outset, he's very ominous, and he's very stern. But of course, with enough alcohol in him, he loosens up and he starts telling a lot of his stories of India. And then he finally gets on the most intriguing thing, and it's a topic he can't help but muse over and talk about, despite whatever suffering it's caused him. Specifically, that it's given these wishes, and that despite all that pain and suffering, it's still something he's held on to, and he wants to actually be rid of. And despite the fact that he throws it into the fire, he doesn't really keep Mr. White from rescuing it as much as he encourages him just to let it go. Knowing what we know after reading the story, you go, why wouldn't this guy have just let it happen or force it to happen? But again, he's full of alcohol at this point in time, and his inhibitions are a little bit lost. And this is the way he's coping with the things he's seen, kind of thing, right? So that introduces this monkey's paw, right? And there's a couple of different places we can look at the initiating or the inciting action. Specifically, though, we've got when Major Morris introduces the monkey's paw, that kind of brings out a little bit of intrigue. But then there's also when Mr. White rescues the paw from the fire, which I would say is probably most likely the case there. And then when he makes his first wish, which I think is probably the least likely. So let's kind of break those down real quick. So the introduction of the paw obviously sets things off in motion in a way, but it really isn't until it ends up in Mr. White's hands and he rescues it from the fire, that first action. It's the transference of that power of the paw, because there are 3 wishes there. 2 people, including Major Morris, has had it already. So that it goes to Mr. White. That's now in his possession. Morris lets him have it, and from that point forward, it starts the chain reaction of his wishes, and so on. And all that is now inevitable. Like, the fact that he is drawn to this paw means things are going to happen, right? So that's really our initiating and our inciting action, I think, at that point. So when we look at our rising action and conflict, we have depending on where we determine initiating action, and if I'm going with the whole when he rescues the paw, it's really those 3 wishes that he takes, right? So the first 2 wishes, one is for that money, the 200 pounds, and they get it at the expense of their son, right? And then time goes on, and then they make that second wish, and that second wish is to bring their son back, right? And even then, while we're building up tension, we really don't have the climax of the story yet. And even his third and final wish, okay, also fits into the rising action. So that you may go, well, isn't that the climax? And you could make an argument that that is part of the climax, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So we see a transition of the characters from amused to devastated and ultimately to depressed, and then to desperation, right? And every time they mess with fate, things only get worse. So as they refuse to accept their fate, they continue to try and control it. So that's going to come up in the next slide here. So then what the question is what is our conflict in this story? So we have two things to really go off of. One is, of course, the character versus fate. Mr. White tries to change his fate. That's the whole point, right? This old fakir changes or puts this curse on this monkey's paw to show that man can't mess with his fate, and anybody who tries to make these wishes always ends up with calamity and suffering because, again, they were asking for something they did not earn and was not their fate to have. So he has to consider that, and we see Mr. White's character being that side where he doesn't look ahead, he doesn't think of the future, and as a result of that, bad things happen, and the chess game itself is a foreshadowing of this, correct? So the character versus self is another thing, because he has to learn to think ahead, and he has to accept the consequences of his actions or his fate. So that brings us to the next section here. So when we see the point of greatest tension, okay, it is not even when he makes his final wish, because when he makes his final wish, we're like, okay, what's going to happen, right? And there's this pause, and they both go, whatever, let's just go to bed. And they go to bed. And then they hear that knocking at the door. And this is where we now know. This is where we see our climax. This is where it starts getting really freaky because we're all going, what's behind the door? And it gets louder and louder, right? And as Miss White is frantic to try and get the door open, Mr. White realizes, oh, this was a terrible mistake, right? And he goes to fumble for the paw, right? And this is our climax, right? And the climax ultimately is that point exactly where he makes his wish and she opens the door, right? So the question then we have here is, what is at risk here? That's something we need to consider is, why is Mr. White making this wish again, right? Like, there's a knock at the door. Hey, your son's back. It's great. Or what? What's actually happening here? You know? And so we have to speculate what's behind that door, right? It could be the son just, hey, Mom, Dad, I'm fine. No, it was the wrong body. It was me. I was just out with buddies and, you know, or something happened to me or whatever. Some weird situation. We don't know. Or she could open the door to the maimed body of her undead son, and it could literally scare her to death or who knows what, right? But it could be absolutely gruesome. We don't have a clue what's behind that door. But in the end, when that happens, he's in a panic, and he decides he's going to make that final wish. Okay? And there we have our falling action and resolution. Okay? So these falling action and resolution kind of happen all in the same little paragraph. It's all pretty tightly knit at this point because of how intense that climax was. So we have, they both occur at the same point when the knocking stops and Miss White opens the door. And we can assume something about what he wished for, and that he wished that his son remained dead, right? Or that his son goes away, or whatever happens, but is gone. The knocking stops, and there's nothing there. So the question then is, why is that important? Okay? And this is kind of where we're getting, kind of leading into the theme. But why this is important is because it ultimately is the point in the story where Mr. White accepts his fate. My son died. I can't bring him back. Not in the way I should. Things happen weird ways. This is not going to end well. And so he makes that final wish. Okay? Now this makes Mr. White a round and dynamic character. Why? Because, well, he's a guy we ultimately see change. He's a guy who's got a lot of different, you know, emotions. And this also was a heartbreaking thing, right? Because in the end, this man has to actually wish his own son dead again. And we don't know what was behind that door. It might have been his completely healthy son who just happened to have decided to go on some impromptu vacation, and it was somebody else who got caught in the machinery. We don't know. No clue. And he just had to actually wish his son dead. He had to actually have his son killed twice. Right? I mean, and that's devastating when you consider the consequences there, right? And the circumstances. So the resolution here is when they look out onto the empty lane, and there are no more wishes, and their fate is sealed, and their son is gone. Now, let's talk real quick about symbols before we get into the actual theme. So we got a bunch of different things we could consider as symbols in this story. And I know this is a dubious thing, and remember what we talked about with John Green and the whole what did the author intend and so on. But there are certain things we can go, okay, this definitely jives a little bit. So the chess game, right? The chess game, in a way, is a symbol of Mr. White's ignorance and recklessness, impulsiveness. Chess is a game that you have to play with strategy, right? And if you don't, you lose. Okay, it is also a foreshadowing of what is to come in terms of that whole inability to think ahead and what causes. The monkey's paw, obviously, there is this idea of human greed and human desire to control our fate. That's all wrapped up in this symbol. And it can also represent the one thing we try to leverage to change our lives. Okay, and it comes in this weird format. We could talk a little bit about, like, what does a monkey's paw, like an actual monkey's paw, represent? But we're not going to get too deep into that. Then there's the white's name. The white is a color usually purity, but it also is one that often is geared towards ignorance and inexperience. So the whites themselves demonstrate that. They're kind of a sheltered group of people. Then there's the 200 pounds. This is literally and figuratively the cost of their son's life. The machinery that Herbert White gets caught in, and in a way, he gets caught in the machinery of his father's fateful decisions. So we could make an argument there, and then a knock at the door. Maybe that's fate itself knocking at the door. We could make an argument for that. And again, these are just things where we can explore these ideas. You may, you may poo-poo some of them and be like, oh no, I don't know if it's that. But these are things for us to consider as symbols. Again, those are things that help enrich the text. They don't have to necessarily always be concrete. Again, there's that whole authorial intent versus the reader's perspective there. Okay, now themes. What themes do we see in the story? We have the danger of toying with our fate. That's pretty obvious, right? Be careful what you wish for, that kind of thing. But seeking what has not been earned, right? And the issue with that, like, and then the idea of there's no shortcuts in life, trying to take the shortcut is ultimately going to end in calamity. We might not see it now. We might see there's advantage for now. But then we see over the time how that doesn't add up to success or to our fortune. Then the importance of thinking ahead, not acting rashly or in ignorance, understanding consequences as well to our actions, and knowing that there are consequences, right? And then, of course, the difference between the domestic and the outside world. And this one's a little bit harder to see, but you have the whites who are very sheltered people. They live kind of off the beaten path. They live in this little cloistered house and settlement situation there, and no one comes to visit because the outside world's going about its business, and it's a dangerous place, right? And they have a false sense of safety about that. So when the guy like Morris shows up and is telling them about these exotic things, and they've never heard anything about it, and they just kind of, oh, yeah, whatever, that's fine. They don't take it very seriously, and he tries to warn them, like, no, the world is a much more dangerous place than you understand, and it ultimately causes destruction for them. So that's mostly it for us. That's all, folks, and if you'd like, there is actually, even as famous as the story is, there is a Simpsons clip that you can watch. If you click on that video, it will take you to that Simpsons clip, and you can watch and enjoy. Thanks for watching this presentation. Bye, guys.